On March 31st, 2001, the Sega Dreamcast was discontinued worldwide. In case you're unaware, the Dreamcast was Sega's fifth and final gaming system release in 1999. The Dreamcast had a good launch, but the system ultimately failed due to poor sales and fierce competition with the Sony PlayStation 2, among others. After the discontinuation of the Dreamcast, Sega backed out of the hardware business, now producing games for other gaming platforms. But nonetheless, the Dreamcast is considered one of the best gaming systems ever made, and even after its discontinuation in 2001, independent developers have continued to support it, creating and releasing games for the platform. But also in 2001, Nintendo released the GameCube, a system that had a much longer lifespan, lasting from 2001 to 2007, but was also considered a failure due to lackluster sales, only controlling about 13% of the video game market in 2003. And other than Sega porting some of their old Dreamcast games to the GameCube, these two systems had very little to do with each other. The Dreamcast was already discontinued long before the GameCube launched, and in terms of sheer power, the GameCube was more capable. But in 2003, a peripheral for the Dreamcast was created. A peripheral that had such a limited release that finding any documentation on it is nearly impossible. I got my Dreamcast on Christmas of 2000, when I was around 9 years old. I remember at school, kids would constantly talk about how awesome it really was. Its graphics, its games, its online features. Everyone was in love with the Dreamcast, and I knew I had to see it for myself. Almost every day leading up to the end of Christmas break, I was playing Sonic Adventure and Crazy Taxi on my Dreamcast. Everyone at school was right. These graphics were amazing, and the games were great too. However, the first few weeks after school started up again, the Dreamcast craze started to die down, and kids started talking more about the PlayStation 2, a much more powerful system. But I still kept playing on my Dreamcast, even after its discontinuation in March of that year. But as the months progressed, I started to lose interest. There just weren't any more games that interested me. But in October of 2001, a couple of my friends were talking about this new system to release the following month. The Nintendo GameCube. I remember my best friend Max flipping through the pages in a Nintendo Power magazine to a page of GameCube previews on it, and those previews alone got me very excited. The graphics looked amazing. Not necessarily by today's standards, but back then, it was revolutionary. They looked better than the Dreamcast and had a lot of compelling games being teased in the previews. I knew right then and there, I wanted it. But when I got home and told my mom about the GameCube and how much I wanted it for Christmas that year, she was quite opposed. "You already have that Dreamcast," she would say. "Why don't you play on that?" I was disappointed. I tried asking my dad instead, but even he wouldn't budge. It took me a while for me to accept that I was stuck with an outdated console, and being a 10-year-old with no allowance, probably wouldn't be able to get the GameCube for some time. So, the GameCube launched, and because Max had gotten it for Christmas, I would frequently go over to his house and play it with him. And I can say that it blew me away. Everything that I had seen in the previews was one-to-one with the final product. But even as 2002 was coming to a close, I wanted a GameCube. However, one day in December of the same year, my mother dragged me out to go shopping with her, an activity that I was never fond of. We went into the mall and went into shop after shop, all of which had items I didn't really want or find interesting. But as we walked past the electronics store, I noticed something in the display window. An advertisement for something called DreamCube. play thousands of GameCube games on your Sega Dreamcast, coming early 2003. This caught my eye. A device that would allow me to play GameCube games on my Dreamcast? It was like a dream come true. I stopped my mom and turned her attention to the advertisement, hoping that the concept would appeal to her. I don't know, Sean. We'll see. We continued walking, and I looked back in disappointment. I ended up forgetting about the GameCube, mainly because there was little to no information about it, even online. But on April 6th, 2003, my 12th birthday, I opened up my last gift, a GameCube, along with a GameCube controller and Luigi's Mansion. I was ecstatic, and although I didn't get a GameCube system, I was happy that I would now be able to play GameCube games on my Dreamcast. I thanked my mother and rushed to my room where I hooked it up. The GameCube itself was a disk drive that connected to the serial port on the Dreamcast, mainly due to the fact that the GameCube used proprietary mini discs as opposed to regular sized discs. It also came with an instruction manual and a Dreamcast controller to GameCube controller converter plug, which would plug into any one of the Dreamcast controller ports to allow a GameCube controller to be used. Upon booting up the Dreamcast with the discs inserted into the GameCube disk drive, a customized startup sequence played. Which was somewhat like a combination of the Dreamcast and GameCube startups. After the startup sequence, the screen displayed copyright information regarding Visionary Inc., the developers of the GameCube, as well as a warning. Warning. Do not under any circumstances use this device for standard Dreamcast games. This warning was rather interesting to me. Why was I unable to use the GameCube with regular Dreamcast games? These questions were short-lived, however, as I shifted my attention to Luigi's Mansion as the game's title screen appeared. As for the graphics quality of the GameCube, it was noticeably lower compared to an actual GameCube. This is probably because the GameCube was superior to the Dreamcast in terms of specs, which probably meant that the game had to be downscaled in order to properly run. The gameplay experience, however, was nearly identical to the experience I've had at friends' houses. I had a ton of fun. Luigi's Mansion truly lived up to the screenshots I saw in the Nintendo Power magazine 2 years prior. The game was quite an unusual take on most Mario games. You play as Luigi, who won a mansion in a contest he hadn't entered, and he goes to the mansion to find that it is actually haunted and that his brother, Mario, is missing. Instead of running, jumping, and stomping on Goombas, you're instead exploring the haunted mansion and sucking up ghosts in a vacuum. It was a very short game, but I really liked it overall, and it was very unique and charming. As time went on, I bought more GameCube games to play on my GameCube. I had friends pointing out how inefficient and weird it was to play GameCube games on my Dreamcast, and while I somewhat agreed with them, I would take what I could get. But a few months after my birthday, I noticed something. I couldn't find a GameCube anywhere else. I would go to the mall with my mother, and at the electronics store in which I first saw it, I had no traces of the product. No posters, no reserved shelf space, not even a listing online. It did strike me as kind of odd. Searching for info online led me to some articles from local sites talking about the device, and that's about it. It did linger in my mind for some time. I wondered why it seemed that the GameCube disappeared from the store shelves. But as time went on, I eventually just stopped thinking about it. A few years passed, and I found myself using the GameCube less and less. It was a good accessory, I was just growing somewhat tired of it. I'd gotten more GameCube games such as Animal Crossing, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Metroid Prime, but I found myself becoming more interested in other things in gaming around that time. One of these interests was the Xbox 360, and because I actually had an allowance during the time it came out, I was able to save up and buy one. But all in all, my GameCube remained essentially untouched, only picking it up if I was in the mood to play any GameCube games. Until the end of 2006. I was bored and had nothing to do, but seemingly out of nowhere, I remembered the warning screen that would show up when booting up the GameCube. The one that said not to use the device when running standard Dreamcast games. It was really just a split-second thought I had when I booted it up for the first time, so I didn't really understand why this was coming back to me now. Nonetheless, out of sheer curiosity, I got the Dreamcast out and hooked it up along with my GameCube. Instead of inserting a GameCube disc in the GameCube's disk drive, I inserted the Dreamcast disc into the console. I hesitantly pressed the power button and sat down in front of my TV. I was met with a black screen. No startup animation, no error message, nothing. Just a black screen. It took me a second to fully process what had happened. I had likely just bricked my Dreamcast. Or at the very least, the GameCube. I turned off the system and detached the GameCube from the system's serial port and tried again, just to make sure I didn't brick the entire system. Nothing. All that was shown was still the black screen. I slumped back into my seat. I had just bricked my Dreamcast. All because my curiosity got the better of me. I was reasonably upset. But I was also confused as to how you would brick the system just attempting to run a Dreamcast game with the GameCube connected to the system. It didn't make much sense to me. I was disappointed. Although I hadn't played much GameCube or Dreamcast games for a while up until that point, it was still a system that I enjoyed and had memorable experiences with. Regardless of my disappointment for not just bricking my system, but also because my curiosity had gotten the better of me and ended up not following the simple instructions that were given to me from the start, I ended up counting my losses and moved on. And so, time passed. I slowly began to forget about the GameCube and in turn, my Dreamcast. But when I was 20 and in university, something happened that reignited my interest. I was living in a dorm while attending MIT from 2009 to 2013. And while I was on break in 2011, I decided to go visit my parents, who still lived in the house I grew up in. It was great to see them again. We got caught up, had some laughs, and then during a conversation, my father said this. "Hey Sean, you remember that Dreamcast thing you had when you were younger?" "Yeah, I do. I remember I accidentally broke it trying to play a Dreamcast game with the GameCube I had with it," I responded. "GameCube? You mean the thing we bought you that let you play those GameCube games you wanted?" my mother asked. "That's why you stopped playing it?" After I'd bricked my Dreamcast, I didn't tell my parents, mainly out of fear that they would get angry at me. "Yeah, but I kind of forgot about it after all this time. What made you bring it up?" I asked. My parents explained that while looking through the attic one day, they found a box containing my Dreamcast with the GameCube add-on, as well as the controllers and games for both systems. I was fairly intrigued by this, but I explained to them how the Dreamcast was bricked and that I doubted that I would be able to use it again. Nonetheless, I left with a few boxes of my old things, including the one with my Dreamcast and GameCube. When I got back to my dorm, my roommate had left to go work at his part-time job, so I brought the boxes from out of my vehicle and into my dorm. And instead of studying, I decided to rummage through the old boxes for a nostalgia trip. I found some of my old comic books, sketchbooks, and even a few t-shirts 5 sizes too small. And then I got to the box with my Dreamcast. I opened it up to find the system, the GameCube, and the games with the controllers. I knew that it was bricked, but I had an overwhelming urge to give it another go. I knew full well that a console can't just unbrick itself, but I just had to see if it was still unplayable. With a sigh, I began setting up the system with the GameCube add-on. I put the Luigi's Mansion disc into the disk drive, attached the GameCube controller to the GameCube's controller conversion plug, and inserted it into the Dreamcast controller port. And then I pressed the power button. I expected a black screen, but to my disbelief, the system booted. It booted up with the DreamCube's customized startup animation, and showed the warning saying not to use the device with standard Dreamcast games. I was shocked. How was this happening? This system was bricked when I was 15 and hasn't worked since. What happened that somehow caused the system to unbrick itself? Luigi's Mansion booted, and out of sheer curiosity, I proceeded to play. My save was still there, so I loaded it. Everything worked as it should. I started in Professor Egad's lab, and I was given the choice of where I wanted to go. I went to the mansion and explored a little bit. But I didn't really have much reason to continue beyond that. Everything worked as it should, so I headed back to the mansion's foyer and spoke to the toad next to the door. This is how the game was typically saved. The toad would tell you something regarding the current events in the game, and a save prompt would appear. I've gone through this process numerous times in the past, but in this specific instance, instead of the normal dialogue, it said something that at the time, I had difficulty processing. Where is the sun? It hasn't come out since March 31st, 2001. It's cold and dark. Everybody is screaming. 3,914 days have passed since the sun last fell. And everyone's still hoping for it to come back. But me? I don't know how to feel about it. Part of me feels as if we're better off. It's just the end of an era, I guess. This line of dialogue left me stumped. Why was this here? I didn't understand it at the time, but for some reason it kind of intrigued me. I had never seen this dialogue before, and it left me both confused and curious. I continued playing the game. I figured that because this was set up through a dialogue box, I could find more lines of dialogue like this by finding random NPCs and talking to them. I got a different response for every NPC I spoke to. Some were longer than others, but here were some of the most notable to me. This one I saw while speaking to the toad on the balcony. Getting to the top is hard. Like, very hard. You need a lot of strength if you want to pass the others. But when I started pushing harder, I actually made it a decent amount. But I should have known that it would have all crashed down quickly. This next one I saw while speaking to the toad in the outhouse in the backyard. I remember I held a few parties while I was still in the game. Those were good times, but after the last one, I just couldn't keep my balance. I found another one when speaking to the toad in the bathroom. I get phone calls asking when I'm coming back, and I always have to tell them that I'm not. That's the one thing people don't get. Why can't they just move on? Why can't they let me live in peace? And then the last one, from the toad in the courtyard. I don't need help climbing. I don't even want to climb anymore. They keep trying to make me climb again, even though they should know by now that I'm not coming back. Ever. I almost lost everything during my first fall. And yet I got out alive. But if I ever come back, I would certainly lose so much more. All of this was very strange to me. But I still felt captivated. I didn't know what to make of it, but it really seemed as if it was some kind of puzzle that I needed to solve. But even at that, why was it here? I tried to analyze what I've seen so far, and if it held any sort of relevance or meaning, but due to the cryptic nature, it had me thinking for a while. But it then occurred to me that I might have to go to another specific area to get more information. So I traveled throughout the mansion, going from room to room, interacting with nearly everything in them, hoping that it would trigger something, anything. Nothing happened, and I thought I was at a dead end. But then I remembered the dialogue that started this quest. The text heavily related to climbing. And after some thought, I figured that I might have to climb something somewhere in or around the mansion, but I didn't know what to climb specifically. There aren't too many climbable areas in the game that I can name off the top of my head, which made this task slightly more difficult. I tried to think of a climbable area in the game that could have at least some environmental relevance to these mysterious pieces of dialogue. And then I remembered at the roof of the mansion. There is a ladder that leads to the top of the chimney. I thought that I might as well try that first, so I made my way to the rooftop and positioned myself in front of the ladder. I took a deep breath in both hesitation and excitement as to what I might find. And then I began climbing. But instead of stopping once reaching the top of the chimney, it just continued. It somewhat reminded me of the infinite staircase in Super Mario 64, where you couldn't reach the top until you collected 70 power stars. But I continued climbing, wondering if it would take me anywhere. And at first, it didn't seem to end, but considering the fact that this ladder was never infinite in a normal playthrough of Luigi's Mansion, something had to be at the end. I just needed to keep going. A few minutes went by, and I was beginning to feel as if I wouldn't find anything here, and that I once again hit a dead end. But then I noticed something. As I was climbing, a white light slowly filled the screen. I didn't expect this, but I kept climbing until the screen turned completely white. I let go of the analog stick and sat there, waiting for something to happen. And to my surprise, a video began playing.
Hello. I would like to introduce you to a boy named Sammy. Hello, Sammy. Sammy was born in 1982 and led an average life. His friend Nicholas was born in 1985, and they were the best of friends. They laughed, they danced, and most importantly, they climbed the competitor's tree together. The competitor's tree was the largest tree in town, and the best tree to climb for young Sammy and Nicholas. They climbed it every day together, and when they climbed the competitor's tree, it was no longer fun and games. They were rivals. But at the end of the day, it was all in the name of good fun. One day, Sammy and Nicholas met a new friend. Simon, born in 1995, joined Sammy and Nicholas's competition, and the friendship between them grew faster than ever. Nicholas was the best climber, at least until Simon came along, who surpassed Nicholas further than he had ever expected. Sammy, on the other hand, was slower in the start, but he eventually sped up and climbed higher. He slipped a few times, but as to be expected. Eventually he was able to surpass Nicholas, although for a very short time. But one day, everything would change for these three fearless friends. Sammy climbed and climbed, and miraculously managed to pass both Nicholas and Simon. Sammy decided that he would stop to celebrate. But this was short-lived. As Sammy danced on his little branch, Simon climbed higher and higher until he arrived at Sammy's position. Sammy was startled and fell off the branch. He fell a long way, and with a thud and a crunch, he was on the ground. Sammy did not get up, which means the ambulance had to take him to the hospital to help his injuries. The doctors took Sammy to the trauma bay, where he received many kinds of treatment. Sammy was hooked up to various machines to help him breathe that were connected to him via tubes inserted in different areas of Sammy's body. The doctors managed to save Sammy's life, but at a cost. Sammy lost the ability to use his legs, which meant he could no longer climb the competitor's tree with Nicholas, Simon, and their new friend Michael, born in 2001. At first, Sammy was sad, but later on he realized that just because he could not join the action, does not mean he can't see the action. So, Sammy went to the competitor's tree every day to cheer on Nicholas, Simon, and Michael as they continued on their adventure. To this day, nobody has made it to the top of the tree yet, but Sammy feels comfort knowing that when someone does eventually make it up there, he will be there to see it.
At first, I didn't know how I should have interpreted the video. It only seemed to make things more confusing. The screen turned to black and displayed the following message.
You're probably confused right now, questioning what you just saw. I can't give you a straight answer, but I'll give you a hint. What you just saw was history. The aftermath of a long battle. Two competitors came head to head and both were defeated by the new kid on the block. One of them got out alive, while the other became a shell of its former self. I grew up to see it all happen. The new kid took on the master, which was the genesis of a new story, but they couldn't keep it up and fell from Saturn. And then it all ended when they finally woke up from the dream. I'm going to assume that you're reading this sometime in the late 2000s or early 2010s, since we had programmed the GameCube to essentially lock up both itself and the Dreamcast when a GD-ROM was used with the GameCube add-on. Of course, only for a certain period of time. I'm just going to say this. Let it rest. Let them be in peace. You do not need to keep playing with this add-on. It was never meant to be made anyway, which is why we removed all references to it online and in stores. You are free to relive your memories, but this is just unnecessary. There is no point in supporting a system that met its end 2 years after it launched. The Sega Dreamcast was the end of an era of success and failure, and it will always live on in the legacy it left behind. Thanks for your support. Logan Vanderpool, founder and CEO of Visionary Inc. It is now safe to turn off your console.
I took a few minutes to think about this message. I paced around the room trying to think of some sort of significance all of this might have, and I later came up with a conclusion, at least in my interpretation of it. Everything that the system had been showing me, from the Luigi's Mansion dialogue to the mysterious developer message, was telling the story of Sega's success and eventual failure. And it began to make more sense as I thought about it more. Sega was climbing up the competitor's tree with the success of the Genesis and fell off with the failure of the Saturn and Dreamcast. But there was still far, far more that I didn't know. Like why all of this was created in the first place, and simply why the message stated that the GameCube was never meant to be made. Those were things I didn't have explanations for. I understood what it was telling me, but I didn't understand why. I looked back at the TV, which now read no signal. The Dreamcast must have powered itself off a while after the message had appeared. I walked over to it and tried to turn it on again. Nothing. I tried again with the GameCube unplugged, and still nothing. I sat back down and began to remember back when I first tried running a Dreamcast game while the GameCube was plugged in, and how upset I was when I had bricked it in the process, although I now know it was locked by the GameCube. But now, I wasn't upset. As off-putting and confusing this experience was, I couldn't help but feel nostalgic throughout. I had loads of memories with the system, and to see it die right in front of me is a bit saddening. But I accepted it. It was time to move on. I grabbed the system, and put it back in the box along with the controller and GameCube, and placed it in the closet in my bedroom. I stood up and looked down at the box one last time before shutting the closet door. I don't plan on going back to it anytime soon.